October 23rd, 2077, the world ended in minutes. But the real story of how humanity collapsed began decades earlier. This video uncovers everything the games and show only hint at: the secret experiments, the corporate sabotage, and the decisions that pushed the world into nuclear fire. Across 25 parts, we're rebuilding the entire Fallout timeline, from the first resource wars to the rise of super mutants and the birth of the Brotherhood of Steel. And here's the twist: the Great War may not have been started by any nation, but by a corporation with everything to gain. Hit subscribe. Now let's begin. The universe of Fallout is built upon a profound and complex alternate history divergence that took place shortly after the end of the Second World War, setting the world on a technological and political path entirely distinct from our own. While the mid-20th century saw a brief respite of global peace in our timeline, the Fallout world instead embraced a sustained, intense period of Cold War paranoia that never truly subsided. The aesthetic of the time became permanently frozen in the 1950s, where the social conservatism, optimism, and distinctive artistic styles of that decade were fused with the radical technological promise of atomic energy. This fusion created a unique retro-futuristic style where massive chrome-plated cars ran on tiny nuclear fusion batteries. Homes were equipped with friendly, sentient robot assistants, and consumer goods were designed with a bold, streamlined but ultimately dated visual flair. The promise was that nuclear power would provide an endless, clean source of energy that would solve all the planet's problems and usher in an age of leisure. However, this technological leap forward failed to solve the fundamental problems of human greed and scarcity. The intense focus on miniaturization and domestic application of nuclear technology meant that the development of sustainable, non-nuclear energy sources was largely ignored. While the cars and appliances hummed with atomic energy, the global economy remained utterly reliant on the limited reserves of fossil fuels for heavy industry, military operations, and, most crucially, the production of plastics and other essential materials. The world became a battleground of political ideologies and resource depletion, fueling a continuous, simmering conflict. The geopolitical landscape was dominated by two primary antagonistic powers: the United States of America and the Communist People's Republic of China. The decades between 1950 and 2050 were marked by continuous military buildup, intense espionage, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear, where the simple, brightly colored advertisements for nuclear-powered toasters served as a chilling juxtaposition to the very real threat of global atomic annihilation. The divergence meant that the political institutions of the United States also failed to evolve past the mid-20th century mindset. Extreme nationalism, aggressive isolationism, and an unshakable belief in American technological and military supremacy dominated the government's policies. All opposition to this worldview was immediately branded as communist espionage, leading to a profound cultural and intellectual stagnation. The technological development, while amazing in its energy applications, was heavily skewed toward military and defense purposes, resulting in the creation of powerful walking suits of power armor and advanced weaponry that represented the peak of the nation's engineering genius. This technological prowess masked a deeply corrupt and increasingly desperate government, which was losing control of the global situation as the planet's reserves dwindled. The United States, convinced of its own righteousness, began to see the entire world as a set of resources to be controlled rather than as independent nations with their own sovereignty. The growing global instability meant that the nation's focus was almost entirely consumed by the fear of war, providing immense opportunities for defense contractors and corporations who promised security. This created an environment where companies could gain immense political power by providing solutions to national fear. The relentless pursuit of a defense advantage led to highly unethical scientific endeavors, such as the initial research into genetic manipulation and viral weaponry, often conducted in secret under the guise of national defense. This period saw the normalization of scientific cruelty in the name of political victory, setting the stage for the moral catastrophe that would define the post-war wasteland. The entire era, despite its cheerful televised facade, was a ticking time bomb, driven by the unsustainable technological imbalance and the intense Cold War dynamic that was escalating toward a resource-fueled global catastrophe. The beautiful, retro-futuristic dream was built on an incredibly fragile and highly flammable foundation of nuclear paranoia and dwindling resources, an unsustainable balance waiting for a single spark to ignite the final, devastating war. The inherent flaws in the Fallout world's divergence began to show themselves dramatically as the 2060s transitioned into the 2070s, marking the escalation of the resource wars. The reliance on nuclear power for consumer goods had masked the catastrophic depletion of the planet's fossil fuel reserves, which were essential for the military-industrial complex and the basic manufacturing infrastructure that sustained civilization. As the last global oil fields began to run dry, the world was plunged into a desperate struggle for control over the remaining energy supplies, a conflict that escalated quickly from political tension to full-scale global warfare. The first major sign of this terminal decline was the Euro-Middle Eastern War, a conflict that spanned many years and eventually consumed the last of the major oil fields in the Middle East. The desperate European nations, once powerful and united, devolved into a brutal civil war amongst themselves, each fighting for the meager remaining energy and resources necessary to sustain their populations and armies. This long, protracted war drained Europe's economic and political strength completely, resulting in its total collapse as a major geopolitical power. The European nations, once key players in global affairs, effectively vanished from the main geopolitical stage, leaving the United States and Communist China as the sole remaining superpowers capable of projecting influence. The collapse of Europe was a profound warning sign to the United States that their own massive consumption was unsustainable, a warning that the government deliberately ignored, preferring to focus on aggressive acquisition rather than conservation. Facing immense internal pressure from their own dwindling resources and driven by an intense desire to secure a dominant position in the post-resource world, the United States government took an extreme, unprecedented step: the annexation of Canada. This was not a diplomatic negotiation, but a full-scale military invasion in 2076 to seize control of the limited remaining natural resources within the Canadian territories, most critically the reserves of fresh water and certain strategic minerals. The annexation was a brutal, drawn-out military occupation that was highly unpopular even within the United States, but it was pushed through by a desperate government that viewed absolute control of resources as the only path to survival. The United States forces maintained an iron grip on Canada, using the occupied territory as a massive staging ground and resource bank for their escalating conflict with China. This act solidified the United States' position as an aggressive, totalitarian power, utterly abandoning any pretense of democratic idealism in its final, frantic grab for survival. Meanwhile, the conflict with Communist China moved from a distant, ideological struggle to an immediate, physical war. The scarcity of resources led to the Sino-American War, primarily fought over the last untouched source of oil and strategic territory in Anchorage, Alaska. The Chinese forces launched a massive, prolonged invasion of Alaska, which the United States defended ferociously. The war in Alaska became a grinding, technologically advanced conflict, marking the first major deployment of the massive T-60 power armor suits by the United States military. Despite the technological superiority of the American forces, the Chinese invasion was relentless, forcing the United States to commit all its remaining military resources to the defense of the vital territory. This desperate, global conflict over a handful of remaining resources pushed the world to the very brink of destruction, creating the perfect conditions for the final, terminal nuclear exchange. The final two global powers were so consumed by their death grip over the planet's resources that they utterly failed to recognize that their actions were rapidly leading to the destruction of the world they were fighting over. In the years leading up to the great global cataclysm, no corporation achieved greater political power and pervasive influence than the Vault-Tec Corporation. The history of Vault-Tec is not merely the story of a defense company, but the chilling tale of an organization that seized control of the nation's deepest fear, nuclear annihilation, and weaponized it for their own dark post-war agenda. Vault-Tec's immense rise to power began around 2031 and accelerated rapidly as the resource wars and the threat of nuclear conflict became terrifyingly real. Vault-Tec was established as a defense megacorporation, specializing in high-end, highly secure underground structures and specialized infrastructure. Their political genius lay in their ability to market a single, unassailable product: survival. As the political and military situation deteriorated and the public became increasingly terrified of a full-scale nuclear war, the United States government initiated a massive civil defense project known as Project Safe House. Vault-Tec won the incredibly lucrative, massive contract to design, construct, and manage a national network of sophisticated fallout shelters, known simply as the Vaults. This contract granted Vault-Tec an unprecedented level of access to government funds, high-level military technology, and the deepest secrets of the United States continuity of government plans. The public perception of Vault-Tec was one of patriotic reassurance and technological genius. Their advertisements, featuring the cheerful, wholesome face of actor Cooper Howard, promised a safe, clean, and perfectly ordered future below ground, a sanctuary where American values and culture would be preserved, while the world above was consumed by fire. this powerful, positive public image allowed the corporation to operate with near impunity, shielding its true, dark intentions behind a veneer of national service and optimism. The company actively engaged in intense lobbying and political maneuvering in Washington, D.C., ensuring that all legislation and defense spending prioritized their work. The immense power of Vault-Tec was not limited to construction. It extended into scientific and political control. The corporation successfully secured contracts for designing not only the physical structures of the vaults, but also the crucial life support systems, cryogenic storage facilities, and the advanced computer systems necessary to keep the vault dwellers alive for hundreds of years. This control over the essential infrastructure of post-war survival meant that the senior executives of Vault-Tec were effectively the true inheritors of the post-war world, holding the literal keys to the future of the American population. Furthermore, the corporation's executives were deeply connected to the highest levels of the United States government, often working hand in hand with the military-industrial complex and the highly secretive government agencies. This close, symbiotic relationship allowed Vault-Tec to integrate their secret, unethical goals into the official government project. Their influence grew to such a level that by the mid-2070s, Vault-Tec was less a defense contractor and more a shadow government. Its true agenda, known only to a select few high-ranking executives who viewed the approaching nuclear apocalypse not as a tragedy, but as a long-awaited opportunity to reshape society according to their own ideological designs. The entire nation's fate and the supposed future of humanity was now firmly in the hands of a corporation driven by cold, scientific ambition rather than genuine humanitarian concern. The truth behind the glossy, optimistic advertisements and the promise of salvation lay in the Vault-Tec conspiracy, Project Safe House. While the vaults were presented to the public as a unified, national effort to preserve human life and American culture from nuclear destruction, their secret purpose was far more sinister, serving as a comprehensive network of unethical social experiments designed and implemented by Vault-Tec executives. The ultimate goal of these experiments was not survival for all, but the study of human behavior under extreme conditions to engineer the perfect post-war society. The public purpose of Project Safe House was straightforward: to provide a sanctuary for a predetermined number of citizens for a period of 200 years, after which the inhabitants would emerge to repopulate and rebuild the devastated nation. The vaults were advertised as uniformly equipped, perfectly regulated environments where life would continue much as it had before the war. The reality, known only to the highest echelons of Vault-Tec and a few government collaborators, was that nearly all of the vaults were designed with a purposeful, devastating flaw, a variable designed to induce stress, chaos, and conflict among the inhabitants. These variables ranged from the absurd to the cruelly complex. Some vaults were designed for seemingly benign social tests, such as one vault where all the inhabitants were given no more than one working object or one type of musical instrument, testing the effect of extreme limitation. Others were designed with fatal, complex social engineering problems, such as a vault with 1,000 people and only enough supplies for 10 years, forcing them to turn on each other. Still, other vaults housed only a single gender, or only one child and one adult for every 50 inhabitants, testing reproduction and social dynamics under conditions of absolute demographic imbalance. The goal was to study how these different societies would collapse, survive, or mutate under different stress factors, providing Vault-Tec with the necessary data to design the perfect future society, a plan that would ultimately be executed by their surviving executives. The few control vaults, such as the future Vault 33 and its immediate neighbors, were specifically designed to function exactly as advertised, maintaining a stable, self-regulating society. These control vaults were crucial to the experiment, providing the baseline data against which the deliberately chaotic experimental vaults could be compared. However, even these control vaults served a darker, secondary purpose. They often housed Vault-Tec's own junior executives in cryo-sleep, ensuring that a fresh, uncorrupted generation of leadership would awaken centuries later, ready to inherit the engineered societies and govern the post-war wasteland. The entire project was a massive, nationwide abuse of public trust, funded by taxpayer money, but serving a wholly private, ideological, and deeply unethical corporate agenda that viewed the American people not as citizens to be saved, but as lab rats in a massive underground vivarium. The charismatic public image that allowed Vault-Tec to execute its dark, clandestine plans was personified by Cooper Howard, a famous Hollywood actor who became the wholesome, trusted face of the corporation's survival campaign. Cooper Howard's pre-war life and his later tragic transformation into the ghoul connect the nostalgic, optimistic past directly to the harsh, mutated reality of the wasteland, making his story central to the entire Fallout lore. Before the war, Cooper Howard was a beloved movie star, known primarily for his roles as heroic, traditional cowboys in Western films. His public persona was one of simple, unwavering American patriotism, moral integrity, and traditional family values. Vault-Tec recognized that his familiar, trusted face was the perfect tool to sell the concept of the vaults to a terrified public. He starred in countless advertisements, assuring families that the vaults were not just shelters, but a guaranteed way to preserve the American way of life against the rising threat of communism and nuclear fire. He was the visual anchor that lent an air of security and legitimacy to the entire deceptive Project Safe House. However, Cooper Howard himself was tragically unaware of the full scope of the conspiracy he was promoting. He genuinely believed in the promise of the vaults as legitimate fallout shelters. His family life was intertwined with the very corporation he promoted, as his wife, Barb Howard, was a high-ranking Vault-Tec executive. Barb, along with other senior leaders, was one of the few people who knew the truth about the Vault's true purpose as social experiments designed to manufacture a desirable future society. Cooper's position as the wholesome, unwitting spokesman for his wife's company perfectly illustrates the deep layers of corporate and personal deceit that defined the final years of the old world. The tension between Cooper's public image and his wife's corporate reality eventually led him toward a nascent understanding of the truth. His growing disillusionment with the excessive militarism and corporate control of the United States government was hinted at in private moments. he began to question the integrity of the Vault-Tec promise, sensing the pervasive corruption and the desperate scramble for control among the elite. This suspicion was confirmed when his wife's true, cold adherence to the Vault-Tec ideology became clear. Despite this growing awareness, Cooper was ultimately too late to prevent a catastrophe or to secure a control vault place for his family based on genuine survival rather than experimentation. When the Great War finally erupted on October 23, 2077, Cooper Howard and his young daughter, Janie Howard, were on the surface, caught directly in the initial nuclear exchange. They survived the immediate blast, but were exposed to massive doses of radiation. This exposure did not kill them, but permanently altered their biology, transforming them into ghouls. This transformation granted them an extended, seemingly endless lifespan, but left their physical appearance horribly scarred, withered, and mutated. A living, grotesque monument to the nuclear horror. The beloved actor, the public face of the American dream, was reborn as a relentless, cynical survivor in the wasteland. A man forced to spend centuries roaming the ruins he once promised would be safe, carrying his deep bitterness toward the corporation he once championed. His physical survival ensured that the memory and cynicism of the pre-war world would remain a potent, terrifying force in the centuries to come. The escalating resource conflicts and the pervasive fear of a final global war provided immense funding not only for Vault-Tec, but also for specialized military contractors engaged in highly unethical research. Central to the creation of the most terrifying mutated threats in the post-war wasteland was West-Tec, a major defense corporation that became the primary developer of the forced evolutionary virus. The research conducted at facilities like the Mariposa military base was intended to secure the ultimate advantage for the United States in its desperate war against China. But it ultimately led to a monstrous legacy of superpowered mutations. The initial goal of the Forced Evolutionary Virus Project, often referred to by its acronym FEV, was driven by the military's urgent need for a decisive edge in the increasingly brutal and technologically balanced Sino-American War. The virus was not initially designed to create monsters, but to engineer super soldiers, genetically enhanced humans with unparalleled strength, resistance to disease, and accelerated healing capabilities. West-Tec's scientists, operating under immense pressure from the United States government, believed the FEV could unlock the full dormant potential of the human genome, turning ordinary men and women into unyielding, biologically superior combatants capable of winning the grinding war in Alaska and the resource struggle around the globe. The experiments conducted by West-Tec were incredibly cruel, involving the abduction and forced inoculation of human subjects under the guise of medical testing. The early trials demonstrated the terrifying instability of the FEV. Instead of producing universally stable super soldiers, the virus often resulted in disastrous and horrific mutations, proving to be deeply unpredictable. The FEV worked by manipulating the DNA of the host, but the outcomes were highly variable depending on the host's baseline genetic structure, the method of administration, and the presence of other environmental factors, especially the radiation that was increasingly prevalent in the environment. These failed experiments were often brutally contained and covered up by West-Tec and their military overseers at the Mariposa military base. The ethical and moral compromises made during the FEV research were so profound that they contributed directly to the formation of the Brotherhood of Steel, one of the wasteland's most powerful and enduring factions. A military unit stationed at the Mariposa base, led by Captain Roger Maxon, discovered the true, horrifying nature of the experiments being conducted by Vault-Tec. The sight of the caged, horribly mutated victims and the systematic cruelty of the scientists shocked the unit's moral core, leading to a profound crisis of conscience. They realized that their own government was committing crimes against humanity worse than any enemy they were fighting. This realization prompted Captain Maxon to lead his unit in a desperate mutiny, rebelling against the corrupt United States government just before the final nuclear war began. The unit executed the scientists responsible for the FEV research, declared their independence from the old government, and sequestered the advanced technology and the horrifying research data from the base. This act of moral rebellion, born from the atrocities of Vault-Tec's super soldier program, became the foundational moment for the Brotherhood of Steel's philosophy that advanced technology was too dangerous for unmonitored human use and must be hoarded and controlled to prevent future global catastrophes. The FEV research, initially meant to win the Sino-American War, instead created the basis for the supermutants and also inadvertently gave birth to a major post-war faction dedicated to technological asceticism. Part 7. As the Sino-American War raged, draining the last of the world's resources, a fleeting possibility of peace emerged. A fragile window that ironically may have provided the final incentive for Vault-Tec to ensure the war reached its nuclear conclusion. The peace talks' failure and corporate incentives are critical to understanding the depth of the conspiracy, suggesting that the Great War was not merely a tragic accident of two exhausted global powers, but possibly a deliberate action by a secretive, third-party, corporate entity. The primary tension driving the final resource struggle was the conflict between the United States and Communist China. By the late 2070s, both nations were pushed to the absolute breaking point. The United States had successfully driven Chinese forces out of Alaska in 2077, but the economic and military costs of the Anchorage campaign had been astronomical. Both governments were facing mass civilian unrest, economic collapse, and the very real possibility of internal revolution due to the extreme shortages of energy, food, and basic necessities. The war was militarily won by the United States, but was unsustainable for both sides. Against this backdrop of mutual exhaustion, diplomatic channels were secretly reopened. The idea of a global peace treaty was floated, one that would see the two superpowers de-escalate their military posture and attempt to collaboratively manage the remaining global resources. This potential peace represented an existential threat to the Vault-Tec Corporation. Vault-Tec's entire massive infrastructure and political power were predicated on the assumption of total nuclear war. Their lucrative government contracts, their political influence, and their grand scheme for post-war societal control depended on the complete annihilation of the existing world order. If peace were to break out, the need for the vaults would vanish overnight, Project Safe House would be exposed as a massive waste of taxpayer money, and the unethical nature of the Vault-Tec social experiments would likely be revealed, leading to the corporation's total collapse, criminal prosecution for its executives, and the immediate end of their vision for a corporate-controlled future. The threat of a lasting peace was arguably more terrifying to the Vault-Tec leadership than the war itself. Therefore, the senior executives of Vault-Tec, who were already deeply embedded in the United States government and military command structure, had every corporate incentive to push the conflict past the point of no return. While there is no definitive proof of who fired the first missile, the lore strongly suggests that Vault-Tec used its influence to destabilize the already fragile global situation. This could have involved planting false intelligence, sabotaging peace negotiations, or even initiating a limited nuclear exchange to trigger the full retaliation from China, knowing that the system was already rigged to escalate to total annihilation. The corporate desire for a guaranteed future, one where they held the keys to the remnants of civilization, superseded any humanitarian concern for the billions of lives that would be lost. The threat of peace did not deter the war. It seems to have accelerated it, turning the diplomatic crisis into a final, calculated opportunity for Vault-Tec to execute its corporate takeover of the future. The failure of the peace talks was not a failure of diplomacy between nations, but potentially a success of manipulation by the true power brokers behind the scenes. Part 8. The slow-burning resource wars and the pervasive paranoia of decades reached their terrifying ultimate conclusion on Saturday, October 23, 2077, in an event known simply as the Great War and nuclear annihilation. This conflict was unlike any in human history because it began and ended in a single, catastrophic day, marking the instantaneous suicide of global civilization. The exact cause and initiator of the exchange remain one of the galaxy's greatest mysteries. Some historical accounts suggest the United States preemptively launched to neutralize the perceived remaining threat from China, while others argue that the Chinese retaliated after a false alarm or a perceived first strike. Given the intense instability, the frayed nerves of the military leaders on both sides, and the suspected corporate sabotage by Vault-Tec, the ultimate trigger was likely a single, calculated misstep or act of desperation that spiraled instantly out of control. Once the first nuclear missile was confirmed to be launched, the predetermined protocols of massive retaliation kicked in across both global powers. The initial exchange lasted no more than 2 hours, but in that short 120-minute window, thousands of warheads were launched and detonated across the globe. Major cities, military installations, energy production centers, and industrial hubs across the United States, China, and the last remaining areas of geopolitical importance were vaporized in blinding white flashes. The missiles were precise, devastating, and numerous, ensuring the near total destruction of the planetary infrastructure and the collapse of all centralized governance and communications. The speed of the attack left no time for large-scale evacuation or organized military response, paralyzing the world in the blink of an eye. The physical effects were immediate and apocalyptic. Massive shock waves leveled buildings for hundreds of miles. The intense thermal radiation from the detonations ignited vast, uncontrollable firestorms that consumed entire metropolitan areas, generating immense columns of smoke and dust that rose into the atmosphere. The most profound and lasting effect, however, was the widespread release of radioactive fallout. The nuclear debris, pulverized by the blasts and carried by atmospheric currents, rained down onto the surviving landscape, rendering the surface permanently toxic and mutagenic for centuries. The planet was instantly transformed from a world of cities and nations into a radiation-soaked wasteland. For the vast majority of the human population, the Great War was the end. Billions perished in the initial blasts and immediate fallout. Only a tiny fraction of humanity survived, divided into those who were lucky enough to be in the hastily constructed Vault-Tec shelters and those who were forced to endure the immediate aftermath on the surface. Among the surface survivors were people like Cooper Howard and his daughter, who survived the initial explosions in Los Angeles, but were catastrophically exposed to the intense radiation, initiating the process that would transform them into ghouls. The day the bombs fell was the day the old world died, instantly ending the resource wars by eliminating the resources and the civilization that fought over them, leaving only the grim, irradiated silence of the dark time. Part 9. The moment the final warheads detonated and the firestorm subsided, the world entered the immediate post-war world and survivors, a period of absolute societal collapse, known for centuries afterward as the Dark Time. The sudden annihilation of all global structures, governments, and infrastructure meant that civilization did not merely decline, it ceased to exist instantly, plunging the few survivors into a brutal, primal struggle for existence against an incredibly hostile environment. The overwhelming reality for anyone on the surface was the immediate, pervasive threat of radiation. The fallout had tainted everything: the air, the water, the soil, and the remaining food supplies. Surviving the initial blast was only the first small step. The long-term challenge was avoiding fatal radiation sickness and the inevitable genetic mutations caused by continuous exposure. This forced survivors to quickly adapt, developing basic forms of radiation protection, scavenging for unexposed goods, and desperately seeking uncontaminated sources of water, often leading to violent conflicts over the smallest, purest reserves. The collapse of all government meant that law, order, and morality dissolved instantly. There were no police, no armies, and no central authority to enforce rules. The few remaining military units either devolved into small, self-serving gangs, or, in rare cases like the nascent Brotherhood of Steel, dedicated themselves to their own specific ideological goals. The power vacuum was immediately filled by the most ruthless and resourceful individuals, leading to a rise in banditry, enslavement, and cannibalism. The rules of civilization were replaced by the harsh, immediate necessities of survival, where trust was a luxury few could afford. The first survivors to emerge from the vaults, the vault dwellers, did so years or even decades after the war, when they finally left their organized, brightly lit, and perfectly sterile environments. They were often completely unprepared for the reality of the irradiated wasteland. Their ignorance of the outside world, their reliance on the Vault-Tec system, and their general naivete made them vulnerable prey for the hardened surface dwellers. The conflict between the sheltered, idealistic vault dwellers and the cynical, mutated surface wastelanders became an immediate feature of the post-war landscape. The immediate survivors had only one purpose: to find a safe place and a stable source of food and water. This led to the formation of the very first primitive settlements. These were often small, temporary camps established around rare intact resources like a still functioning well, a fortified pre-war building, or a stash of canned food. These early settlements were highly vulnerable to raids by raiders, hostile mutated creatures, and other desperate survivors. However, these small, scattered groups of people, pooling their resources and their collective memory of the old world, represented the absolute genesis of future post-war civilization. Their struggle for survival in the silence and ruins of the annihilated world was the first painful step toward rebuilding what had been so tragically lost. Part 10. The true origin of the Brotherhood of Steel, the highly recognizable, technologically fixated military order that patrols the wasteland in massive suits of power armor, is rooted not in the chaos of the post-war world, but in a courageous act of moral rebellion that took place just hours before the bombs fell. The founding of the Brotherhood of Steel centers around Captain Roger Maxon's military unit at the Mariposa military base in California. Captain Roger Maxon was a decorated officer of the United States Army, commanding a highly trained unit stationed at the remote, secretive Mariposa military base. The base was the primary site for the horrific forced evolutionary virus experiments being conducted by the Vault-Tec Research Corporation under the military supervision. Maxon and his unit were initially unaware of the true nature of the research, believing they were guarding a standard military installation involved in classified defense projects against the Chinese. The turning point came when Maxon scientists discovered the full truth. The military and Vault-Tec were not simply developing a defense system, but were actively abducting and torturing civilians in a desperate, criminal attempt to create super soldiers using the FEV. They saw the horrifying mutated results of the failed experiments and the caged victims who were once ordinary citizens. The realization that their own government was committing crimes against humanity shattered the unit's loyalty to the corrupted ideals of the United States. They understood that the moral integrity of the government had completely dissolved in the face of resource desperation. Driven by an absolute moral imperative, Captain Maxon and his unit formally mutinied. They disavowed their allegiance to the United States Army and the collapsing government. Their first act was an immediate, ruthless execution of all the Vault-Tec scientists involved in the inhumane FEV research. This was a statement that their new, self-declared mission was to guard against the misuse of science and technology. They secured the advanced weaponry, the massive suits of T-60 power armor, and the complex scientific databases stored at the base, effectively seizing control of one of the United States' most technologically advanced facilities. In the hours immediately following their mutiny, and just before the nuclear exchange began, Roger Maxon gathered his remaining troops and began to establish a new, codified set of ethical and operational rules. The core tenet of this emerging philosophy was that advanced technology was inherently dangerous and must be hoarded, preserved, and controlled by a select, disciplined group. They viewed the nuclear war that was about to unfold as direct proof that humanity was too reckless to be trusted with its own creations. This commitment to controlling technology became the founding principle of the Brotherhood of Steel. When the Great War finally erupted, Maxon led his forces and their precious cargo of technology out of the doomed Mariposa base and into the relative safety of the wasteland, transforming the unit from a mutinous army detachment into an ideological, technological order. The Brotherhood of Steel was thus born, not from a desire to rebuild democracy or civilization, but from a profound commitment to prevent the next apocalypse by strictly limiting humanity's access to the knowledge that nearly destroyed it. Their origin story explains their fierce devotion to power armor and their deep mistrust of any unmonitored scientific or technological advancement. Part 11. The immediate aftermath of the Great War was characterized by the Brotherhood of Steel's grim, disciplined campaign to establish their new order and the simultaneous, chaotic emergence of the first enduring post-war settlements. The initial decades following the nuclear exchange were critical for determining the shape of the future wasteland. The first decades, Brotherhood and the early settlements saw the former United States Army unit, now led by Elder Roger Maxon, begin their long march across the toxic ruins of California, while scattered groups of survivors cautiously began to put down roots. The Brotherhood of Steel, still operating with the military rigor of their past, immediately focused on their core mission: the preservation of advanced technology. Their members, clad in their salvaged T-60 power armor, appeared as terrifying armored demigods to the few scattered surface dwellers. They operated less as a government and more as a technological monastic order, systematically sweeping pre-war military bases, research labs, and corporate facilities. They did not use the technology for widespread humanitarian aid or to rebuild society. Instead, they hoarded it, ensuring that complex weapons, sensitive data, and advanced scientific knowledge were placed under strict, armed guard. This action, while preventing the recurrence of disasters like the FEV research, also alienated them from the general population, who saw them as selfishly controlling the keys to human recovery. The Brotherhood's early days were spent primarily in the California region, a highly irradiated landscape that provided them with ample targets for technological acquisition. They established highly fortified bunkers and hidden valleys as repositories for their growing collection of knowledge and gear. Their patrols were ruthless in dealing with raiders and anyone attempting to exploit dangerous pre-war technology, cementing their reputation as both protectors and harsh zealots. They were focused on the purity of their mission, often neglecting the more mundane but necessary tasks of agricultural development or social organization, a failing that would later come to define their internal political conflicts. Parallel to the Brotherhood's movements, groups of ordinary survivors began to overcome the initial radiation and chaos to establish permanent, functional communities. These settlements were often founded by the most resourceful of the surface dwellers, but crucially, some of the most successful were founded by the first groups of vault dwellers to emerge from the shelters. These vault dwellers, though initially naive, possessed two critical advantages: a lack of extreme radiation damage and the priceless knowledge of pre-war agricultural techniques, basic engineering, and community organization, One of the most important of these emerging communities was founded by the inhabitants of Vault 15. This vault suffered a serious internal crisis, splitting its inhabitants into several factions, who left the shelter prematurely due to social strife. These scattered groups of former dwellers, along with allied groups of surface survivors and nomadic merchants, eventually converged on a relatively safe and resource-rich area of Southern California. Their combined efforts, utilizing the technical knowledge of the dwellers and the hard-earned survival skills of the wastelanders, laid the absolute foundation for the settlement that would eventually be named Shady Sands. This initial success demonstrated that future civilization would not be built by singular heroes or high-tech zealots, but by the collaborative efforts of ordinary people committed to democratic, organized labor. The difference between the Brotherhood's rigid technological pursuit and the dwellers' more human-focused efforts would define the coming conflicts on the West Coast. Part 12. The establishment of Shady Sands was a monumental event in the history of the wasteland, marking the transition from the desperate individual survival of the dark time to the organized, communal effort to rebuild civilization. Shady Sands, founded around the year 2162, near the ruins of what was once San Diego, California, and quickly became a beacon of hope for the ravaged West Coast. The settlement was built on the foundations of agricultural self-sufficiency, an achievement made possible by the unique combination of the land's relatively low radiation level and the pre-war knowledge possessed by the Vault 15 survivors. These survivors possessed the invaluable skill of cultivating crops in the mutated soil and managing water resources, skills that were forgotten or corrupted by the general surface population. This stable source of food immediately set Shady Sands apart from the typical temporary scavenging camps that dotted the wasteland. It provided a reliable foundation for sustained population growth and economic stability, allowing the inhabitants to focus on social organization rather than constant, desperate foraging. The settlement's success attracted thousands of other survivors, including farmers, merchants, tradesmen, and even reformed raiders seeking a safe place to settle down. This influx of population and skills allowed Shady Sands to rapidly evolve beyond a simple farming village into a highly organized, democratic society. The leaders of the original Vault 15 group successfully established a system of shared governance, utilizing basic democratic principles salvaged from their memories of the old, pre-war world. This commitment to democratic rule and community cooperation was the ideological counterpoint to the authoritarian military structures of the Brotherhood of Steel and the corporate dictatorship of Vault-Tec's hidden agenda. As Shady Sands grew, it became a central hub for trade and commerce across a wide area of the former California. Merchants, risking their lives on dangerous trade routes, used Shady Sands as a secure destination, allowing the exchange of rare goods, technology, and most importantly, information. The flow of goods created wealth, which in turn funded basic infrastructure like roads, security forces, and crude communication networks. This burgeoning economy provided a powerful stability that allowed for social development, including the establishment of rudimentary schools and centers for medical treatment. The establishment of Shady Sands was the first definitive proof that humanity could successfully overcome the legacy of the Great War and the threat of radiation. It was proof that the idealistic principles of democracy and self-governance could take root even in the most hostile environment. The continued success and growth of the settlement inspired other small communities to emulate its structure, forming alliances for mutual protection and trade. The shared success created a sense of unified purpose and shared regional identity among the survivors, laying the critical groundwork for a larger, unified political entity. The seed planted by the disciplined farmers and idealists of Shady Sands was about to bloom into the first nation state of the New World. Part 13: The Logical and Inevitable Evolution of the Successful, Sprawling Settlement of Shady Sands was the creation of the New California Republic, or NCR, founded around the year 2189. The NCR was the first large-scale democratic nation-state to emerge since the collapse of the United States, representing the best hope for a peaceful and prosperous future for the West Coast and potentially the entire wasteland. The founding of the NCR was driven by the necessity of scale and protection. As the affiliated settlements around Shady Sands grew in size, they began to face external threats that individual communities couldn't handle alone. These threats included large-scale raider gangs, the growing menace of mutated creatures, and most significantly, the early, terrifying incursions of the first super-mutant armies, created by the catastrophic failure of the FEV research. It became clear that a unified military and political structure was required to defend the burgeoning civilization. The NCR was established as a federated democratic republic, consciously modeling its structure on the idealized version of the pre-war United States government, featuring an elected president, a functioning Congress, and a strong emphasis on the rule of law. The first capital was established in Shady Sands itself, symbolizing the republic's roots in agriculture, self-governance, and survival. The goal was to extend the basic prosperity and safety enjoyed in the core settlements to a much wider geographical area, incorporating every small farming community, fortified town, and trading post that agreed to abide by the Republic's constitution and democratic principles. The central pillar of the NCR's ideology was the restoration of civilization. They focused on building permanent, lasting infrastructure. They cleared major roads, established centralized currency, and created a formal, uniformed military capable of defending its expansive borders. Their focus was firmly on the humanitarian and political aspects of rebuilding, prioritizing the welfare and freedom of its citizens over the pursuit of high-end technological treasures. This focus provided them with immense popularity among the common people, who saw the NCR as a genuine government dedicated to their safety and prosperity. The rapid growth of the NCR soon brought it into direct ideological conflict with the other major emerging faction, the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood, dedicated to technological hoarding, viewed the NCR's democratic, expansionist philosophy with profound suspicion. They feared that the NCR's burgeoning industrial capacity and its use of rudimentary pre-war technology would inevitably lead to the same hubris and self-destructive tendencies that caused the Great War. This fundamental disagreement over the role of technology and governance would lead to decades of tension and low-level conflict between the two groups. each believing they knew the true path to securing humanity's future. The creation of the NCR marked the end of the initial dark time on the West Coast. Civilization had returned, not in the form of a corporate tyranny or a military dictatorship, but as a democratic experiment. It was a promise that the ideals of the old world could be salvaged, providing a massive, organized counterpoint to the nihilism of the wasteland, and setting the stage for the true power struggles of the 23rd century. Part 14, the 2 decades following its founding, were known as the NCR's Golden Age and West Coast dominance, a period of unprecedented expansion, stability, and democratic consolidation that cemented the new California Republic's position as the most powerful and hopeful political entity in the post-war United States. By 2241, the NCR was a sprawling, recognized nation-state, controlling a massive amount of territory that extended far beyond its initial borders in Southern California. The key to the NCR's success lay in its economic and agricultural foundation. Unlike the fractured societies that relied solely on scavenging and raiding, the NCR was built on fertile, reclaimed farmland. Their ability to consistently produce vast surpluses of food, known as NCR produce, allowed them to sustain a rapidly growing population and a massive professional army. This economic stability allowed for specialization of labor, the development of major cities, and the creation of a stable currency that was widely accepted by merchants across the entire West Coast. The political system of the NCR was one of its greatest strengths. The commitment to democratic elections and the rule of law provided the population with a sense of ownership and investment in their government. This strong civic pride fueled the expansion of the Republic. When the NCR army moved into new territories, they were often welcomed by smaller settlements and towns who sought the protection and economic opportunities offered by the stable government. The expansion was thus often one of peaceful annexation and mutual agreement rather than outright conquest. The NCR army, unlike the small elite forces of the Brotherhood of Steel, was a large, well-organized military force equipped with standard issue weaponry and supported by massive logistics chains. While they rarely used the technologically advanced power armor of the Brotherhood, their sheer numbers and organized tactics allowed them to effectively clear territories of major raider gangs, quell organized crime, and push back against the early disorganized incursions of super mutants. Their influence eventually extended across vast stretches of the former United States, stretching from California into the Mojave Wasteland and even parts of Oregon and Nevada. However, this rapid growth came with its own set of problems that began to sow the seeds of future conflict and corruption. The Republic's massive size and bureaucracy led to issues of governmental overreach and inefficiency. Expansion brought control of vast, hostile territories, straining the NCR's resources and forcing them to engage in long, costly military campaigns to defend their new borders. Furthermore, the political system became susceptible to the very kind of corruption that plagued the pre-war government, with wealthy landowners and powerful commercial interests gaining excessive influence over the Congress. Despite these internal flaws, the NCR's Golden Age represented a monumental achievement. It demonstrated that humanity could not only survive the nuclear apocalypse, but could thrive, organized under a government dedicated to shared ideals. The sheer scale and success of the NCR made it the largest and most credible threat to the remaining vestiges of the old world's corporate and military dictatorship, particularly the secretive, deeply entrenched Enclave. Part 15. While the new California Republic was busy attempting to build a democratic future on the mainland, the chilling remnants of the old United States government and its corporate elite were quietly surviving and plotting their return. The Enclave's survival and master plan reveals a secretive, highly advanced faction that views itself as the last legitimate heir to the pre-war American civilization, dedicated to restoring its version of order through radical purification. The Enclave was not a group of panicked survivors. It was a pre-planned continuation of the United States government and the interests of the powerful military-industrial complex, including Vault-Tec's senior partners. They survived the Great War in highly secure, self-sufficient installations, primarily located on remote, offshore oil rigs and deep bunkers, places designed specifically to withstand a global nuclear exchange. These facilities housed not only the last vestiges of the United States political and military leadership, but also the most cutting-edge, untainted technology salvaged from the pre-war world, including the latest models of advanced power armor and sophisticated aerial vehicles. The Enclave's ideology was one of extreme, genocidal purification. They believed that the people who survived the war on the surface, the wastelanders, the ghouls, and the heavily mutated creatures, were genetically and morally tainted by the radiation and the chaos. They viewed themselves, preserved in their sealed, high-tech environments, as the last pure humans, and therefore the only people fit to reclaim and rule America. Their master plan, which aligned perfectly with the original, unethical goals of Vault-Tec, was to systematically eliminate all mutated life on the surface, including the entire population of the NCR, using a targeted biological weapon. Their goal was not to rebuild the old democracy, but to establish a new, perpetual technocratic dictatorship ruled by the corporate and military elite. They possessed the full scientific data of Vault-Tec's Project Safe House, and they understood the Vault's true purpose. They saw the chaos in the wasteland as proof that the surface dwellers were unworthy, and that the only true path to a stable future was to eliminate the current population and then begin the process of rebuilding with the pure stock housed in their own facilities and the control vaults. The Enclave operated in near complete secrecy for the first century after the war, gathering intelligence, refining their technology, and working to achieve self-sufficiency. Their first major foray onto the mainland led to clashes with both the Brotherhood of Steel and the nascent NCR. The Brotherhood sought to seize their technology, while the NCR quickly recognized the Enclave's terrifying, totalitarian ideology as an existential threat to their democratic ideals. The existence of the Enclave meant that the struggle for the future was not just against raiders and radiation, but against the ultimate, terrifying embodiment of the old world's worst sins: technological arrogance, corporate greed, and a relentless commitment to control. Their survival and plan provided a chilling contrast to the idealism of the NCR, representing the very kind of totalitarianism that the founders of the Republic hoped they had buried with the old world. Part 16. The research into the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, which began in the pre-war days at the Vault-Tec facility in the pursuit of super soldiers, did not end with the Brotherhood of Steel's mutiny or the Great War. Instead, the surviving viral strains and research data found their way into the hands of a brilliant, highly mutated, and megalomaniacal scientist known only as the Master. His horrific FEV research on supermutants in the West became one of the greatest existential threats to the newly forming civilization of the new California Republic. After the collapse of the old world, the FEV vats at the Mariposa military base remained dormant but intact. They were eventually discovered by a highly intelligent survivor who, through a series of accidents and voluntary self-experimentation with the virus and other technologies, fused his own body with computers and machinery. This figure, who declared himself the Master, became obsessed with the idea of achieving forced, perfect human unity and eliminating the conflicts that destroyed the old world. The Master saw the FEV as the ultimate tool for this unity, believing that by dipping humans into the vats, he could transform them into a single, unified, superior species immune to radiation, disease, and, critically, their own divisive nature. The Master began the systematic forced collection of humans across the wasteland, subjecting them to the FEV. The results were the creation of the super mutants. These creatures were massive, powerfully muscled, green or yellow-skinned humanoids, possessing incredible strength and near total immunity to the environmental dangers of the wasteland. However, the process was far from perfect. Most adult victims suffered severe intelligence degradation and sterilization, becoming hulking, simple-minded brutes, driven by a simple loyalty to the Master and a desire to capture more humans for the vets. The only consistent success in retaining a high intelligence was among very young humans, who were more resistant to the degrading neurological effects of the virus. These super mutants formed a massive, terrifying army under the unified psychic command of the Master. This army began a destructive campaign across Southern California, raiding settlements, capturing victims, and brutally enslaving survivors. The sheer numbers, combined with the immense physical power and resilience of the super mutants, allowed them to quickly overrun scattered communities and smaller outposts of the burgeoning new California Republic. The threat posed by the Master's forces was immense and highly organized, striking at the very heart of the NCR's democratic expansion. The eventual confrontation with this immense threat forced the young new California Republic to commit all its resources to a brutal, protracted war of survival. The existence of super mutants provided a chilling, physical manifestation of the dark legacy left behind by the pre-war government's unchecked scientific arrogance. The Master's experiments proved that the FEV, the very weapon designed to win the Sino-American War, was instead the seed of a new kind of biological nightmare, capable of wiping out the remaining population and establishing a tyranny far worse than the corporate rule of Vault-Tec. The long, desperate battle against the super mutants was a crucial defining moment for the NCR, forging its identity in the fires of conflict against this horrific, green-skinned legion. Part 17. The simultaneous rise of the large democratic New California Republic and the secretive, militaristic Brotherhood of Steel ensured an inevitable ideological clash between the two factions. This period of Brotherhood stagnation versus NCR growth highlights the fundamental incompatibility of their visions for the future, leading to escalating tension and eventually open conflict. The new California Republic was founded on the principles of populist democracy, territorial expansion, and organized agriculture. Its strength lay in its immense, rapidly growing population, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and its broad political appeal to the common wastelander. The NCR's military was large, sustained by a stable economy, and dedicated to protecting its citizens and maintaining the rule of law. The NCR viewed its expansion as a moral imperative, necessary to bring safety and civilization to the anarchic wasteland, even if it meant using recovered technology and basic industrial processes. In stark contrast, the Brotherhood of Steel remained an elite, monastic, and isolationist organization. Their philosophy, forged in the moral outrage over the FEV experiments, was rooted in techno-hoarding. They believed that human beings were too corruptible to be trusted with advanced weaponry and scientific knowledge. Therefore, they dedicated themselves to hoarding and preserving technology, using their precious power armor and laser weapons only to enforce their narrow ideology and to prevent others from accessing dangerous scientific secrets. This core ideological difference led to mutual suspicion. The Brotherhood saw the NCR's use of pre-war tools and its massive, centralized government as dangerously similar to the United States government that caused the nuclear war. They feared the NCR would eventually attempt to reverse engineer the technology they hoarded, leading to another apocalypse. Conversely, the NCR viewed the Brotherhood as selfish zealots who deliberately withheld the very technology, such as advanced power generators and medical equipment, that could accelerate the healing of the wasteland and alleviate the suffering of their citizens. The Brotherhood's refusal to share their massive stockpiles of knowledge and hardware made them an enemy of progress in the eyes of the NCR. The conflict eventually escalated into a series of armed engagements, particularly as the NCR expanded into territories that contained ancient pre-war bunkers and facilities the Brotherhood considered their property. These military clashes were initially localized, but they demonstrated the tension between the two approaches to the future. The Brotherhood, seeking to preserve the past by freezing technological advancement, and the NCR striving to rebuild a mass democracy using pragmatic means. The Brotherhood's strict anti-expansionist philosophy ultimately led to their political stagnation and reduction in numbers, while the NCR's inclusive, expansionist nature allowed it to dominate the West Coast. This conflict was not resolved by the time of the television show, with the Brotherhood remaining a powerful, antagonistic force that the NCR had to contend with across the entire region. Part 18. The story of the Vault Dwellers in the TV show edition is given profound depth through the narrative of Rose McLean, whose decision to leave Vault 33 represents the critical intersection of the sheltered Vault world and the harsh realities of the wasteland. Rose McLean leaves Vault 33 around the year 2277, setting in motion the tragic events that would define the entire McLean family and the fate of the new California Republic. Rose McLean was the wife of Hank McLean, the overseer of Vault 33 and the mother of Lucy McLean. She was born and raised within the rigid, controlled environment of the interconnected Vault 3133-32 system. Like all inhabitants, she believed the official Vault-Tec story, that the vaults were lifeboats for humanity, and that the surface world remained dangerously irradiated and uninhabitable. Life in Vault 33 was predicated on strict rules, cheerful conformity, and a continuous effort to preserve the pre-war American way of life, awaiting the signal to emerge and rebuild. However, over time, Rose began to question the absolute truth of her sheltered existence. It is unclear exactly what she discovered, but evidence suggests she stumbled upon information regarding the true nature of the Vault-Tec experiment, or, more specifically, the nature of the occupants in the cryogenic storage of Vault 31. She realized that their existence was not one of simple survival, but one of predetermined, perpetual obedience to the long-dead corporate plan. Her growing unease turned to fear and conviction when she realized the outside world might not be the death trap their leaders claimed. Driven by a desperate need for freedom and a profound sense of duty to her children, Rose made the momentous decision to breach the protocols of Vault 33. She took her young daughter, the future Dr. Anna Stelline, and fled the underground complex. Emerging into the wasteland for the first time, Rose experienced a massive culture shock, but her intelligence and determination allowed her to survive. She eventually found her way to Shady Sands, the thriving, democratic capital of the new California Republic. In Shady Sands, Rose found a functional, vibrant, and free society, a direct contradiction to the grim post-war landscape described by Vault-Tec. She embraced the surface world, establishing a new life and integrating herself into the community. She found friendship and perhaps a sense of belonging with the surface dwellers, particularly the charismatic leader, Lee Moldaver. Rose's choice to live and thrive on the surface was a direct act of rebellion against the Vault-Tec corporate authority that her husband, Hank, so blindly upheld. Her escape and success became a dangerous anomaly, threatening to expose the very structure and deception that kept the Vault-Tec hierarchy alive, ensuring her freedom would be short-lived and her past would soon catch up to her with a terrifying vengeance. Part 19. The narrative of post-war recovery in the Fallout universe is brutally punctuated by the destruction of Shady Sands, a catastrophic, deliberate act of nuclear terrorism that reversed decades of democratic progress on the West Coast. This event, occurring around 2283, was directly orchestrated by Hank McLean, the overseer of Vault 33 and a dedicated Vault-Tec loyalist, acting on the deep-rooted corporate agenda. After Rose McLean fled Vault 33 with their daughter and established a new life in Shady Sands, her husband, Hank McLean, pursued them. Hank was a junior executive of Vault-Tec preserved in cryo-sleep in Vault 31 and awakened to serve as the overseer of Vault 33. He believed utterly in the company's doctrine that the corporate elite were the only pure people fit to rebuild, and that any independent, unapproved attempts at self-governance, like the new California Republic, were a dangerous threat to the intended corporate order. When Hank located Rose in Shady Sands, he was confronted with a functional, thriving society that was a direct, living refutation of the Vault-Tec lie Rose refused to return to the gilded cage, forcing Hank to choose between his family and the corporate ideology he served. In a horrifying choice that defined his character, Hank chose Vault-Tec, recognizing that Shady Sands was too large and too successful to be politically destabilized or simply ignored, and viewing it as a contaminant to the purity of the future. Hank utilized a recovered, pre-war nuclear device. In a singular, devastating act, Hank McClane dropped a nuclear bomb directly on the capital city of Shady Sands. The detonation annihilated the entire metropolis, instantly killing tens of thousands of citizens, destroying the new California Republic's central government, and obliterating the entire political and economic infrastructure that had been painstakingly built over more than 100 years. The destruction was total and irreversible, throwing the entire West Coast back into a state of intense chaos and fear. The destruction of Shady Sands was the ultimate execution of the Vault-Tec plan. It was not a random act of savagery, but a strategic strike designed to eliminate a competing political structure and ensure that the Vault-Tec executives, emerging from their safe havens, would face no organized resistance. The act effectively dismantled the largest democracy in the post-war world, plunging the new California Republic into ruin and scattering the remaining population into disorganized groups. This tragedy confirmed that the true enemy of humanity was not just the residual radiation or the mutated monsters, but the hidden, corporate elite who viewed the world as their personal experiment. This event provides the immediate, romantic backdrop to the TV show's timeline, explaining the deep suffering of the wasteland and the desperate efforts of the few remaining NCR survivors. Part 20. The fallout, both literal and political, from the nuclear annihilation of Shady Sands was immediate and devastating, defining the setting and the characters of the Fallout TV show edition. The aftermath of the nuke, Shady Sands Survivors, focuses on the utter collapse of the new California Republic and the desperate struggle of those who managed to escape the blast, most notably the future leader, Lee Moldover. The explosion of Shady Sands achieved Hank McClane's cold corporate objective, the effective end of the NCR as a centralized functioning nation-state. The elected government, the centralized military command, and the economic infrastructure were all gone. The survivors were scattered, often traumatized, and entirely disillusioned with the concept of a grand, peaceful republic. The entire region was thrown back into a state of anarchy and lawlessness, with raider gangs and opportunistic forces seizing control of valuable territories once protected by the NCR army. Among the key survivors who emerged from the ruins was Lee Moldover. Moldover was a former acquaintance or friend of Rose McClane in Shady Sands and had a strong background in pre-war history and advanced technology, possibly including a detailed understanding of cold fusion. Following the destruction, Moldover took on a leadership role, gathering the fractured remnants of the NCR military, scientists, and civilians who still held onto the dream of a free, functional society. She established a heavily fortified sanctuary for these survivors at the Griffith Observatory in the ruins of Los Angeles, using it as a base to continue her work and mount a quiet resistance. Moldover's primary objective became twofold: survival for the remaining NCR loyalists and the restoration of unlimited power. She knew that true, Lasting civilization could only be achieved with a powerful, sustainable energy source, and her focus turned to developing or recovering cold fusion technology. This quest put her on an inevitable collision course with Vault-Tec's interests and the Brotherhood of Steel, both of whom had their own proprietary control over energy and technology. The survivors, under Moldover's protection, represented the final, desperate spark of the democratic New California Republic. They were cynical and hardened by the loss of their capital, but their resolve was strong. They knew who was ultimately responsible for the blast: the hidden forces of the old world represented by Hank McLean and the Vault-Tec Corporation. The remaining NCR forces became a small, tightly knit group of resistance fighters, dedicated to seeking revenge for the annihilation of Shady Sands and recovering the technology they needed to truly defeat the hidden enemy. This search for Hank McLean and the means to power their future led directly to the pivotal events that would begin the television series, bringing Moldover and her crew to the gates of Vault 33 years later. Part 21. The post-destruction wasteland, particularly the chaotic, lawless territory around the former Shady Sands, became the crucible for the youth who would inherit the conflict. Maximus's origin and joining the Brotherhood provides the essential backstory for one of the main protagonists of the TV show edition, detailing his transformation from a traumatized child survivor to an ambitious, dedicated member of the Brotherhood of Steel. Maximus was a young boy who was one of the many children who survived the nuclear destruction of Shady Sands around the year 2283. The bombing by Hank McLean turned his entire world into ashes, leaving him orphaned and exposed to the brutal realities of the wasteland. His formative years were spent scavenging among the ruins and navigating the lawlessness that followed the collapse of the New California Republic. This intense, violent period instilled in him a profound cynicism about the nature of humanity, but also a deep desire for order, protection, and vengeance against the forces that shattered his home. His life of desperate survival was interrupted when he was discovered by a patrol of the Brotherhood of Steel. The armored knights, with their imposing, gleaming power armor suits, represented an ultimate, overwhelming form of strength and security that the young, vulnerable Maximus desperately craved. The Brotherhood was not always a kind organization, but they provided a rigid structure, clear rules, and a sense of shared purpose that was missing in the post-Shady Sands chaos. Maximus was taken in, less as a recruit and more as an orphaned apprentice, beginning his arduous training at the local chapter of the Brotherhood near the ruins of Los Angeles. Life within the Brotherhood was strict and demanding. Maximus began his tenure as a squire, a servant, and assistant to a fully armored knight. This position was one of immense subservience, where he was tasked with maintaining and repairing the immense suites of power armor, carrying supplies, and learning the basic tenets of the Brotherhood's techno-religious ideology. Despite the harshness and the constant verbal abuse from his superiors, Maximus excelled. He possessed an innate mechanical aptitude for the power armor and an absolute devotion to the Brotherhood's core principles of order and control. However, Maximus's ambition exceeded the station of a mere squire. Driven by the trauma of his past, he saw the power armor not just as a tool for protecting technology, but as a symbol of the immense power necessary to dominate the dangerous wasteland and finally create a truly safe world, something the failed NCR could not achieve. He was deeply aware of the massive gulf between his own low rank and the status of the armored knights, fostering a quiet resentment and a determination to rise through the ranks, no matter the cost. His journey is defined by this single focus: to shed the memory of the weak, victimized child of Shady Sands and become the unyielding, dominant force promised by the power armor. His path was set towards the attainment of the ultimate authority represented by the gleaming armor. Part 22. As the wasteland descended into renewed chaos following the Shady Sands disaster, Lee Moldaver emerged as the primary guardian of the new California Republic's surviving ideals, dedicating her life to a singular, critical, scientific pursuit: Moldaver, cold fusion, and the last NCR remnants, outlines her desperate quest for a sustainable energy source and the resistance she organized against the forces of tyranny. Lee Moldaver, a highly intelligent figure with a background in pre-war history and advanced energy science, gathered the dispersed Shady Sand survivors and established a major operational base at the Griffith Observatory in the ruins of Los Angeles. This location provided strategic defense and access to pre-war research facilities, allowing her to continue her work. Moldaver's understanding of the geopolitical reality was clear. The NCR had failed because its infrastructure, while vast, was dependent on aging, finite resources. To establish a truly lasting and defensible civilization that could never be destroyed again, they needed unlimited, clean, and sustainable power. Her focus narrowed to cold fusion technology. This was a theoretical or experimental energy source from the pre-war era, promising virtually limitless energy output with minimal waste or risk. Moldaver believed that if she could successfully stabilize and activate this technology, she could provide free, abundant power to all the struggling remnants of the NCR, bypassing the scarcity that had fueled both the resource wars and the nuclear destruction perpetrated by Vault-Tec. This technological breakthrough was not just a scientific goal, it was a political goal, representing the final, definitive defeat of the Vault-Tec corporate agenda, which was predicated on the control of resources. The pursuit of cold fusion immediately put Moldaver in direct conflict with the Brotherhood of Steel. The Brotherhood, dedicated to hoarding advanced technology, viewed Moldaver's attempts to develop and democratize such a powerful, unstable energy source as an existential threat. They saw her as a dangerous radical who might inadvertently trigger the next apocalypse. The Brotherhood began to actively hunt Moldaver and her associates, viewing her NCR remnants as technological anarchists who must be contained. Furthermore, Moldaver's efforts made her a direct, existential threat to the Vault-Tec corporate scheme, which relied on the continued scarcity of resources to maintain the authority of their emerging executives. Moldaver's resistance was fueled not only by her political ideals, but by a personal connection to the tragedy. She was an acquaintance of Rose McLean and deeply aware of Hank McLean's betrayal. Moldaver's organization of the last NCR remnants became a highly secretive, desperate resistance movement, clinging to life and to the hope of a free future, preparing for the day when they could finally activate cold fusion and take revenge on Hank McLean for the destruction of their capital. Her scientific quest became the final battle line for the dream of the new California Republic. Part 23. The idyllic, sheltered life of the vault dwellers on the West Coast is sustained by a complex and sinister corporate structure known as the Vault 3133-32 Connection. This arrangement reveals the ultimate post-war strategy of Vault-Tec to ensure corporate leadership would survive the apocalypse and eventually inherit the wasteland. The three vaults, Vault 31, Vault 32, and Vault 33, are not typical experimental vaults, but are instead part of a tightly controlled, interconnected system in the wasteland. Publicly, the inhabitants of Vault 33 and Vault 32 believe they are normal survivors awaiting the all clear. Their lives are rigidly organized, revolving around specific rituals, such as the predetermined breeding matches between the two vaults to ensure genetic diversity, as exemplified by the marriage ceremony that opens the TV show. The secret lies within Vault 31. This vault does not house ordinary citizens. Instead, it is a massive cryogenic storage facility containing the junior executives of the Vault-Tec Corporation and its associated organizations. These individuals, including the father of Lucy, Hank McLean, were placed into deep sleep before the Great War. Their purpose was to be awakened in rotating shifts across centuries to ensure a continuous supply of leadership for the other two unwitting vaults. The arrangement functions as a corporate time capsule and leadership factory. The Vault 33 and Vault 32 inhabitants serve as the labor and the stable, controlled population for the awakened executives, providing them with a secure power base and a resource-rich environment when they eventually emerge to conquer the surface. The entire system is designed to keep the population compliant, naive, and entirely dependent on the overseers, who are secretly the Vault-Tec executives cycling out of Vault 31. The strict rules, the focus on preserving 1950s corporate culture, and the absolute obedience demanded by the overseers are all designed to maintain the integrity of this experiment. The entire system is a living, breathing mechanism for Vault-Tec's Project Safe House on the West Coast. The corporate executives view themselves not as saviors, but as the rightful inheritors of America, planning to use the skills and resources developed in the vaults to ultimately seize control of the wasteland. The escape of Rose McLean and her discovery of the NCR was so threatening, precisely because it exposed this meticulously maintained deception, confirming that the very leaders sworn to protect the inhabitants were actively perpetuating the corporate tyranny that destroyed the world. The innocent vault dwellers are unaware that their entire existence is merely a means to an end for the sleeping corporate elite next door. Part 24. By the year 2296, the time in which the Fallout TV show edition is set, the geopolitical map of the West Coast is one of precarious balance and simmering conflict. The state of the world is defined by three major forces preparing for an inevitable confrontation, all set against the backdrop of the annihilated New California Republic. The New California Republic, once the great democratic hope, is functionally dead. The central government is gone, and the capital, Shady Sands, is a ruin. Only scattered, demoralized NCR remnants survive, primarily concentrated around Lee Moldaver's base at the Griffith Observatory, desperately working on the cold fusion project as their last hope for reclaiming power and seeking justice. Their focus is singular: revenge against the corporation that destroyed them and the acquisition of unlimited energy. The Brotherhood of Steel remains a powerful military force in the region, centered around their heavily armed bunkers and maintaining strict control over advanced weaponry, including their formidable fleet of airships. They are actively engaged in their eternal mission of hoarding technology and view both the remnant NCR groups and the hidden Vault-Tec interests with equal suspicion. The Brotherhood is preparing for a massive military operation in the region, aimed at securing a critical piece of technology, possibly related to Moldaver's cold fusion research, that they believe is too dangerous to remain on the surface. Within the Brotherhood's ranks, Maximus is an ambitious, low-ranking squire, driven by the ambition to earn his own power armor, serving the knight who will lead the upcoming campaign. Meanwhile, the Vault 31-33-32 system remains intact, operating under the control of Hank McLean, the now compromised overseer of Vault 33. The inhabitants, including his daughter Lucy McLean, live in blissful ignorance of the surface world and their father's past crimes. Hank's goal is simple: to keep the vaults running and to protect the secrets of Vault 31 and the sleeping executives adhering to the long-term Vault-Tec strategy. The stage is set for a three-way clash involving technology, ideology, and revenge. The system of alliances is unstable. Moldaver's NCR remnants are hunting Hank. The Brotherhood is hunting Moldaver's technology, and Hank is focused on self-preservation. The fragile status quo is about to be shattered by an external threat that forces the sheltered world to violently collide with the terrifying reality of the wasteland, triggering a new era of conflict for the entire West Coast. Part 25. The final part of the background lore sets the stage for the narrative of the TV show edition, launching the protagonist's journey and commencing the main action. The beginning, Lucy's journey, starts details the Catalyst event, the raid on Vault 33 that shatters the life of Lucy McLean and forces her and the viewer into the treacherous wasteland. Lucy McLean is the quintessential Vault dweller, idealistic, naive, highly educated in pre-war history, and utterly unprepared for the brutality of the world outside her sealed home. Her life in Vault 33 was one of structured conformity and unshakable belief in the Vault-Tec mandate. Her father, Hank McLean, the overseer, worked hard to maintain this illusion of safety and order, hiding his past as the corporate agent who destroyed Shady Sands. The Catalyst event occurs when Lee Moldaver's NCR remnant forces finally execute their plan for justice and revenge. They launch a daring, massive raid on Vault 33, successfully breaching the massive front door and overwhelming the surprised, unprepared security forces. The motivation for the raid is singular: to capture Hank McLean. Moldaver knows that Hank is the key to both the destruction of Shady Sands and potentially the key to the secrets of Vault-Tec that are necessary to secure her cold fusion project. The raid plunges Vault 33 into chaos, exposing the sheltered inhabitants to their first taste of violence and the reality of the surface world. During the confusion, Hank McLean is successfully captured by Moldaver's forces and dragged out onto the surface. Lucy, witnessing the destruction of her perfect world and the kidnapping of her father, is consumed by a powerful sense of duty and the idealistic belief that she must rescue him. Ignoring the dire warnings and the protocols of her upbringing, Lucy McLean makes the momentous decision to pursue the raiders. She suits up in the basic Vault utility gear, grabs a pistol, and steps through the opened blast door, descending the long elevator shaft and emerging into the irradiated, lawless wasteland for the very first time. Her journey begins as a simple quest to rescue her father, but it is instantly transformed into a terrifying education on the difference between the Vault-Tec history she was taught and the brutal, complex truth of the post-war world. With Lucy on the surface, Maximus in the Brotherhood preparing for his first major mission, and the recently awakened ghoul, Cooper Howard, now actively involved in the chase, the stage is fully set. Lucy McLean's idealistic journey is the ignition point for a massive, multi-factional conflict over technology, power, and the terrifying secrets hidden inside the vaults, officially beginning the main narrative of the Fallout TV show edition.